Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will offer an update on the case of Tracey Nix. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Tracey Nix was born in April 1957 and lived in Wauchula, Florida. This small town is about an hour south of Lakeland. Tracey had worked as a teacher and a high school principal for many years. She was married to a man named Nun Ne Nix, and they lived in a 3,100 square foot house on Kazan Road. The couple had a daughter named Kayla Schock, who lived in the area. Kayla and her husband Drew had two sons, Asher, who was born in March 2019, and Ezra, who was born in August 2020. On December 22, 2021, when Ezra was about 16 months old, Tracey was caring for him at her house. Tracey's husband was also home. Tracey fell asleep on the couch in the living room, and her husband decided to run some errands. When Tracey woke up, she was unable to locate her grandson, Ezra. She looked around and noticed that the garage entrance door was ajar. Tracey went outside, entered her vehicle, and drove around a little bit looking for him. At this point, she called her husband and told him what happened. As she was driving back toward her house, Tracey saw Ezra in a pond, which was just a few feet west of her house. She drove to the pond, pulled Ezra out of the water, and started CPR, but did not call 911. Someone else called 911 at 12:52 p.m. Emergency workers arrived and Ezra was airlifted to a hospital. He had a faint pulse, but did not survive. Here's what the police found during the course of their investigation. Ezra was able to open the garage entrance door, climb under a fence between the house and the pond, and enter the pond. The handle of the garage entrance door was 35 inches from the floor. It was a lever style with a curved handle. It was mounted with a curve on the bottom, which placed the lowest point of the handle at 34.5 inches from the floor. Ezra's maximum reach from the tips of his fingers to his feet was 36 inches. He could reach just far enough to get his finger around that curve in the handle and open the door. No child safety locks were installed on any of the doors in the house. The police interviewed Tracey. She indicated that she had never seen Ezra open a door and did not know he could pull a door handle down. Tracey's husband indicated that, on prior occasions, he had driven Ezra in a utility vehicle to the pond to look at ducks. This could explain why Ezra was motivated to get to the pond. Prosecutors decided not to pursue charges against Tracey. The Florida Attorney's Office said, in cases involving accidental drowning of a toddler, Florida appellate courts have stated that a one-time lapse in judgment would not establish culpable negligence of the caretaker. After Ezra's death, Kayla would not let her other son be alone with Tracey. Kayla stated that she did not trust her mother at all. On March 5, 2022, about 3 months after Ezra's death, Kayla had a daughter named Uriel. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On November 1, 2022, Kayla had an appointment at a hair salon. She failed to put this appointment in her calendar, but was sent a reminder text message a few hours before. Perhaps caught a little bit off guard, Kayla contacted Tracey to babysit Uriel, who was now 7 months old. She did this despite her earlier stance that Tracey was not to be trusted at all. Tracey picked up Uriel sometime around 12 or 12:30 p.m. in her 2019 Lexus SUV. After going to lunch with friends, Tracey drove back to her house and parked in the driveway. This was at about 1:55 p.m. She went into her house but did not retrieve Uriel from the back seat of the Lexus. Tracey forgot her granddaughter was there. The windows of the vehicle were closed, and the high temperature that day was about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. While in the house, Tracey talked to her dog and played the piano for a long time. Eventually, one of her grandsons came by, which led Tracey to remember that Uriel was in the SUV. She informed her husband, who immediately started CPR on the infant. 911 was called at 4:50 p.m. Uriel had been in the vehicle for almost 3 hours and did not survive. On November 17, 2022, 16 days after the incident, Tracey Nix was charged with aggravated manslaughter. On January 15, 2025, she was found not guilty of aggravated manslaughter. However, the jury did find her guilty of leaving a child in a vehicle in excess of 15 minutes, causing great bodily harm. After the verdict, she was remanded into custody without bond. Tracey will be sentenced on April 3, 2025, when she will face up to a maximum of 8 years in prison. Now moving to my analysis. Tracey Nix maintains her innocence. She was acquitted on the charge of aggravated manslaughter, so the jury did not feel as though recklessness was involved. At least they found a reasonable doubt that recklessness was involved. The state, of course, disagrees. They believe that Tracey was guilty of manslaughter. They did manage to get a conviction on the lesser charge of leaving a child in a vehicle, which is still a felony. This charge only requires culpable negligence as opposed to recklessness. That's a key distinction between the charge of leaving a child in a vehicle and aggravated manslaughter. This trial really came down to the level of negligence involved. Culpable negligence requires a gross and flagrant act or omission, which demonstrates a conscious disregard for human safety. It is beyond mere carelessness. Simple negligence is not enough to be convicted of the leaving a child in a vehicle charge. The incident with Ezra, again, he was Tracey's grandson who drowned in the pond next to her house, was not allowed to be introduced at trial. The jury did not know anything about Ezra's death. They only heard evidence related to the hot vehicle incident that claimed the life of Tracey's granddaughter, Uriel. This brings me to the question, was Tracey guilty of any crime related to the death of Uriel? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that she was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. At the time that Uriel died, Tracey was her caregiver. She understood how this was a serious responsibility. Tracey could have declined her daughter's request to watch Uriel. It wasn't like Tracey was forced into her role as a caregiver. This is something that she did voluntarily. After parking the SUV, Tracey entered her house and left Uriel in the vehicle for almost 3 hours. As a result, Uriel did not survive. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Tracey did not leave Uriel in the vehicle on purpose. The state never argued otherwise. Rather, this was accepted as true. It's not like Tracey decided to leave her granddaughter in the vehicle to run into the house and then forgot about her. In that case, Tracey would have been guilty, because initially leaving her granddaughter in the vehicle would have been a conscious decision. This would have supported the idea of culpable negligence. In this case, however, that's not what happened. Tracey did not intentionally leave her granddaughter in the vehicle. One could argue that simply forgetting to do something, even something very important, is not inherently gross or flagrant. Research has found that 25% of parents with children under the age of 3 have forgotten their child in a vehicle on at least one occasion. Did all those parents demonstrate culpable negligence? Should they all have gone to prison? The construct of forgetting a child in a vehicle is referred to as forgotten baby syndrome. Researchers who have examined this syndrome have found that the nature of human memory is flawed. Anything, regardless of its importance, can be forgotten. Tracey was probably accustomed to driving up to her house, parking, and walking in alone. This was her routine. Caring for Uriel deviated from this routine. Human memory has an autopilot system that takes over for repetitive tasks. The system that would alert someone to modify a pattern must compete with the autopilot. Sometimes the autopilot prevails. That doesn't make somebody a criminal. When critical information is forgotten, like the fact that a child was left in a vehicle, time will not bring the memory back. The amount of time it takes before the caregiver remembers is not a measurement of their culpability. A person who forgets something for 3 hours is not 3 times as guilty as someone who forgets something for an hour. It's also important to consider the possibility that memory creation contributed to this tragedy. Not all memory problems involve forgetting. Sometimes they are more about the creation of an inaccurate memory. The human brain has the capability of creating memories for events that never happen. This is referred to as confabulation, and it's quite common. The brain tries to fill in gaps in memory where things normally would have happened. Maybe Tracey believed that she actually carried Uriel into the house because her brain created that memory. Researchers who study forgotten baby syndrome typically advocate against prosecuting people involved in hot vehicle death cases. The controversial nature of these prosecutions is evident in the high level of variance with how jurisdictions respond to these cases. In any particular case of a person who causes a child's death by leaving them in a hot vehicle, we see many different possible outcomes. For instance, never being charged with any crime, being charged with criminally negligent homicide, being charged with manslaughter, which is what happened to Tracey, or in a very small number of cases, a person can even be charged with murder. All these reactions occur in cases which possess essentially the same circumstances. It's almost like the criminal justice system has no idea how to deal with tragedies caused solely by a lapse in memory. In the case of Tracey Nix, the only thing she did was forget. There was no intent, no recklessness, no conscious disregard of a risk. It was just a memory failure. When considering all the factors in this case, do I believe that Tracey Nix was guilty of a crime? In my opinion, no, she was not guilty. The tragic death was caused by simple negligence, not culpable negligence. Some people may look at this case and say, what about the death of Ezra? Doesn't this demonstrate a pattern? Tracey was in charge when Ezra died, and Tracey was in charge when Uriel died. She is the common element tying these two cases together. If the jury had been allowed to consider Ezra's death, would that have changed the verdict? I don't think the case of Ezra and the case of Uriel are substantially connected. The mechanisms involved in each fatality are completely different. The first death involved Ezra escaping the house by opening an exterior door, which is something he had never done before. He was barely tall enough to reach the handle. When he made it outside, he managed to go under a fence and into a pond. Here we see a series of low probability events, which aligned for a disastrous outcome. The second death involved Uriel being left in a vehicle. There was nothing complex about this. Rather, it was caused by Tracey's memory failure. At first glance, having two children die under Tracey's care in less than a year could point to a pattern of culpable negligence. But when examining the evidence more closely, I'm not convinced. It wasn't like the lessons learned from the first death could have prevented the second death. Tracey could have installed child safety locks on every exterior door in the house, and it would not have changed anything for Uriel. One could make an argument that Tracey should have been hyper-vigilant after the first fatality. Why wasn't she super careful from that point on? Even if Tracey did transform into a hyper-vigilant caregiver, she may have been focusing on factors unrelated to memory failure. Again, a memory failure wasn't tied in with Ezra's death. The last question I want to address is the negative reactions which people have had toward Kayla, Tracey's daughter. Some people believe that she bears some responsibility for the tragic outcome. For instance, why did she leave her daughter with Tracey after what happened to Ezra? In my opinion, Kayla's actions were understandable. Again, Ezra's death occurred due to a series of unlikely events. It makes sense that Kayla wanted to give her mother another chance. Unfortunately, this was the wrong decision, but I don't think Kayla is to blame. Many people would have made the same decision under similar circumstances. There is a tendency with the human condition to forgive, to desire healing, and to move past tragedies. One thing is for certain, Tracey has now lost the benefit of the doubt. She can never be trusted again whether the fatalities were caused by culpable negligence or not. Nobody wants to find out if lightning will strike the same spot for a third time. Those are my thoughts on the case of Tracey Nix. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Some people wonder what justice would look like in this case with Tracey Nix. Again, I don't believe she should have been convicted, but running under the assumption that the conviction was just, that she should have been convicted, what would be an appropriate prison sentence? She can be sentenced up to 8 years in this case based on the conviction. I find this to be a curious set of circumstances. When I think about somebody going to prison, I imagine a person who has a hard lesson that needs to be learned, like they did something wrong, or they failed to do something, and that was wrong, and they need to learn that lesson. They're in prison so that they can change their mind about something, so they can realize how their behavior was unacceptable and harmed other people. That learning lesson is really a critical component of prison. Prison also serves other purposes like protecting the public, but I've always viewed that hard lesson as a critical element. It's really important to have a concrete lesson. What is the inmate supposed to learn? When they come out of prison, how have they changed? What questions about themselves and their behavior have they answered in the correct way? It's hard to imagine what this hard lesson would be for Tracey Nix. It's hard to imagine that component being satisfied, that hard lesson component being satisfied. It's difficult to justify prison time. What is she supposed to learn? To improve her memory? In all likelihood, her memory's not going to get any better in prison. As she gets older, it makes sense that her memory might get a little bit worse. So improving her memory, that's not the hard lesson. That's not the objective. Could it be a matter of not caring for children anymore? I think it's pretty unlikely she's going to be caring for children, so that's not really the hard lesson to be learned. Perhaps Tracey knew something about her tendency to forget, maybe something not introduced at trial, like she kind of realized that her memory wasn't so good, therefore she never should have taken on babysitting responsibilities. I guess there's that lesson, but again, that wasn't brought up at trial. That wasn't the focus of the state. The state wasn't saying there was a long pattern of Tracey forgetting things, therefore she should have known she was prone to forget things. That was not at all the argument of the state. They really focused on the idea that leaving Uriel in the vehicle was gross and flagrant. So that kind of brings me back to an answer of I don't know as far as the prison sentence that would be just. I don't think any prison is helpful or warranted in this case. I don't know what lesson could be learned. I don't know how Tracey is supposed to come out of prison a better person. What does that look like? What has to change? So I think without that kind of difficult and life-changing lesson component, it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to go to prison. Again, I view that as a critical component for many incarcerations. Not all, but for many. So I guess my answer to the question of what is a just sentence is, I'm not sure. Prison doesn't really make sense to me, so it's hard to support the decision to send her to prison. Maybe she can use the time to reflect on the pain that was caused by the deaths, and that can make her a more compassionate person. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's something she can do with her time that's meaningful, but is it really necessary for her to be in prison? It's just difficult to find a reason why that makes sense. It's not really that logical to me. I know other people feel differently. A lot of people want to see her go to prison for the death of Uriel, and they would like to see something happen with Ezra's death, like some type of prosecution for that death. That's very unlikely, but it just reinforces this idea that there are differences of opinion here. A lot of people feel that prison is warranted, and maybe it's just for the punishment aspect, to make her suffer for what she did wrong. And that is a valid remedy that society has when dealing with criminals. Prison is supposed to be a place of suffering. In reality, it's a place of unimaginably horrible suffering, but at least it's supposed to be suffering. I don't think it's really supposed to be unimaginably horrible. That's something that's come about through mismanagement. But anyway, that's my thinking on this. I don't think prison makes sense. A lot of other people disagree. It's an interesting argument about a type of circumstance that fortunately doesn't happen too often, but it is something society needs to pay attention to. Forgotten baby syndrome, whether it should be thought of as criminal or not, is something with which society must contend.